So from mid-November, we'd reached a situation where we had about 100 acres of wheat freshly drilled and a camp full of maize, which should have been an easy ride, but we've been harassed by loads of evil birds. The specific birds that I want to moan about today are rooks, but they're very similar to crows and ravens, so I thought I'd take the opportunity to do a cultural history of all three. Of these three, crows are the most commonly seen in gardens and are quite solitary animals, not to be confused with blackbirds, which have orange beaks. Crows are very noisy. They can become quite tame and live in urban areas with pigeons, so we're very used to seeing them today. Ravens are easily distinguished from crows because they're enormous. There's some captive ravens in the Tower of London where my friend took this picture, which no adjective can describe. In the wild, they live mainly in the west and north of the country. The collective noun for a raven is an unkindness, and they're pretty smart, but so are crows and rooks, as we'll come to see. Rooks are also easily distinguishable from crows because they're very sociable and have greyish skin on their faces. They move in groups, which may be called a building, parliament, clamour or a storytelling, and breed high up in trees in colonies called rookeries. These birds are all related. They're part of the Corvid family, which also includes jackdaws and magpies. Jackdaws are tiny and can live in rookeries with rooks, which shows that these birds have formed a demonic alliance. These birds have very interesting cultural associations. They have a sense of foreboding and doom, and an interesting timeless quality as if they're above the normal cycles of life and death, which in a sense I suppose is true because they eat carcasses. Greek philosopher and founder of knowledge Aristotle wrote in his History of Animals when he turned to crows that others are inclined to chastity as the whole tribe of crows, for birds of this kind indulge but rarely in sexual intercourse. So this timeless association is really old. Crows seem unaffected by the march of time and the inevitability of death, so they're not as bothered about reproduction as other animals. Aristotle also wrote, there are birds that live as a rule in the towns, the raven and the crow. These are also visible at all seasons, which perhaps explains why these cultural connotations have been so enduring. As people move into cities, they still interact with these birds. Aristotle then discussed the mutual enmity between the crow and the owl. For owing to the fact that the owl is dim-sighted by day, the crow at midday preys upon the owl's eggs, and the owl at night upon the crows, each having the whip hand of the other, turn and turn about night and day. But he says the crow and the heron are friends. Ancient Greek culture also saw crows as mediators between the earth and the divine. The god Apollo told a crow to look over Coronis, who was pregnant with his child. But when the crow told Apollo that she'd slept with a mortal and the crow hadn't pecked the man's eyes out, in anger Apollo scorched the crow and charred its feathers, which is why crows are black. This role as mediators of the divine is seen in loads of different cultures. The Norse god Odin, who's Thor's dad, sacrificed an eye for wisdom and then relied on his two ravens, Hugin and Munin, meaning thought and memory, to keep watch over the world. But here the ravens are not necessarily bad, they're just creatures of prophecy and agents of the supernatural. When Odin received the valiant dead in Valhalla, they would be brought by goddesses called Valkyries who could shapeshift and often choose to appear as crows. So there's an association with death and immortality and timelessness, but not necessarily in a negative sense. In Celtic cultures you have the goddess Morrigan, who is variously described as a trio of individuals, but can appear as a crow and is associated with war and fate. One of her constituent parts is the Bad, which literally means crow and is the goddess of battle. Similarly, in Welsh culture you have Bran the Blessed and Branwen, which are names deriving from the word raven, and in Japanese culture they're called Tengu, which are messengers of the gods. It's seen all over the world. So where does the doom and foreboding come from? In the Bible, Noah sends a raven from his ark to find land, but it just leaves and presumably feeds on dead animals in the water. So he later sends a dove with more success. Ravens are also the only animals to copulate on the ark, which was apparently not allowed and they were punished for it. So there is a divide between the abandonment of the raven and the faithfulness of the dove. By medieval times, the idea that crows could communicate with the divine was seen as idolatry and was firmly outside Christian thought. The idea that animals might talk or that people might turn into animals as Celtic gods did was strictly forbidden. This didn't stop these ideas, but it meant that if crows were supernatural, they were a demonic presence rather than representatives of other gods. An example of this comes from the 15th century when the monks at Byland Abbey wrote a series of ghost stories about their native Yorkshire. The second one tells a story of a tailor called Snowball travelling from Gilling to his home in Ampleforth at night, when he sees something like a raven flying around his face and sinking all the way to the ground with its wings striking the ground violently as if it ought to die. He presumes that the raven has died, so he gets off his horse to pick it up, when sparks of fire scatter down from the sides of the raven. Snowball considers this a demonic presence, so he crosses himself, invoking the Christian god as a defence against this spirit before the raven flies away. He then gets back on his horse, but the raven returns and flies into him with such force that it knocks him to the ground. The spirit then changes form and returns as a dog, and reveals to Snowball that it's an excommunicated soul. So the connection between people, the supernatural and crows as seen in Greek and Norse culture is so well rooted that it survives into the Christian age, but it's incompatible with Christian thought, so it's given negative connotations. This is aided by the fact that these birds are actually horrible. Crows are scavengers, so they'll eat basically anything, including the eggs of other birds that they come across, so all the little nice birds that we love to see are attacked by these guys. And if any other animal can't defend itself because it's young or weak, the crows will attack it and peck its eyeballs out while it's still alive. But they're also really intelligent. Ravens can mimic speech, and in the case of rooks, there's just loads of them. So over the past few centuries, they've learned that farmers plough fields and put seeds in them, and they've learned that these seeds are pretty tasty. So they sit up in their rookeries, safely out of danger, and then when the seeds germinate, they pull up the young plant and eat the seed off the bottom. This causes a lot of damage to crops because it kills the plant. We've had loads of damage from them this year. You can see just how many of my little wheat babies they've eaten. So this has meant that over the centuries people have tried to control populations of these birds. From the 5th century, falconry became an increasingly popular sport amongst the nobility, reaching its peak between the Crusades and falling out of fashion in the early modern period. Here, crows were hunted alongside other animals like partridges and pheasants and pigeons, so they're not sacred at all. Until the 20th century, rook shooting was a popular social event in which young rooks would be shot off the branches of the rookery before they could fly, which doesn't seem particularly sporting, but it was popular enough that specialist rifles were made for it. Scarecrows are an enduring trope, but these animals are intelligent enough to recognise faces, so they can quite easily learn to tell the difference between a real person and a crude stationary imitation. Today people might use gas guns or create loud bangs to imitate gunshot, but again these birds are really smart, so they soon learn that there's no real threat and just return to the field anyway. You do get kites to mimic larger birds, which I think can be effective, but we try to use the fact that their tiny little brains get confused by reflections of light with some limited success. I suspended some CDs from pigtails so that they'd spin in the wind and create a flashing effect, which was actually quite eerie. This one is snagged, which is one of the limitations of this method, but it creates quite a creepy glow. But I found if one of the CDs stopped spinning, they'd all just congregate on that particular area of the field. They also know what a clamp is, and they know that there's food inside, so as soon as we'd got the maize covered up, they punched loads of holes in the plastic to eat it, which lets the air in and makes it rot. So we've got to keep an eye on this and patch them up. The green sheet is supposed to go some way to prevent this, but if a rat chews a little hole in it, the rooks will descend. This was particularly annoying because there was still maize in the field when they started doing this. So we added some more green sheets while patching these up and found this little newt. I think he's a non-breeding male smooth newt, which is a native species in the UK. He was very sweet, so we popped him down where the sheep came from and he wandered away. The actual characteristics of crows differs from their cultural associations. They are engaged in the great battle to survive that plays out across the world. They're just quite good at it. We have invented these cultural associations and imposed them on the birds without their understanding. I mean, take, for example, the idea that if the ravens leave the Tower of London, the kingdom will fall. This is probably a relatively modern urban legend because ravens used to be everywhere in London, and the earliest reference to captive ravens there was in 1883. And the ravens did leave the tower during the Blitz before Churchill had them restocked. The idea that the kingdom will fall if they leave is probably not even 100 years old. So the desire to create cultural narratives around animals is something that we still do, and many of them are by nature timeless. The threat of the kingdom falling will last as long as the kingdom itself, but the strength of the cultural association with these birds does seem quite unique. Perhaps we see ourselves in them, or maybe it's just that they exist in urban areas, so most people still have contact with them. I know it's still early days for this channel, but YouTube tells me that my audience is 100% male. So it's great to have you chaps along for the ride. Do join me next week when we'll be discussing the agricultural revolution and whether or not it undermined Western democracy.